This has been a wonderful day, a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much to the organizers of this day and this event. I study social networks because as a social scientist, if I could ask one question to individuals that I'm interviewing or surveying, it would be, who do you talk to? What do you talk about? Who do you go to for information, advice, social support? And in that single question, you could get a wealth of information about the person's likely gender identity, race, ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, the amount of money that they make, and even how long they're going to live. Okay? And remarkably, even though we spend a lot of time as policymakers, as academics, and certainly as citizens thinking about things like human capital and the amount of money that we should be putting into education, we spend far less time thinking about the social capital that people have and how to allow them to gain social capital that can fundamentally improve their lives. So today, I'll talk about social networks with respect to gender, but the story that I'm going to tell, to kind of echo some of David's comments, also very much could be told with respect to race, with respect to class, and I'm happy to entertain questions about that at the end. Okay, so social networks very much matter for the reasons that we think that they would, okay? That we get fundamental resources from the people that we know, what we talk to them about, and the connections that they can give us to opportunity. And one of the most important questions that we can ask is merely how many people in everyone's lives do they talk to, okay? And how much, what is the size of their network? Okay. We can know a remarkably large amount about an individual's life chances and their life successes based on the number of network ties that they have. And so today, that's the question I'm going to focus on. And then I'm going to double click on certain aspects of networks. So in preparing this report, I looked at 7 different nationally representative samples, okay, on social networks. We've already talked about a bit today the General Social Survey. This is a nationally representative survey that started collecting network measures in 1985. So I looked at 3 cohorts or 3 years of that data, 1985, 2004, and 2010. I also collected data on what's known as the NSHAP project, or NSHAP survey, which stands for the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project. And there were 3 waves of data that I collected there from 2005, 2010, and 2015. And then I also collected 1 year of TEST data. So TEST stands for Time Sharing Experiments for the Social Sciences. And that was done in 2016. And what this graph shows, I have a pointer here, whoops. Back. What this graph shows is on the x-axis the mean network size of individuals' networks, and then the difference between men and women's networks. And what you'll see is that there aren't a lot of gender disparities between men and women when it comes to overall network size. And in fact, women tend to do a little bit better than men in terms of their networks overall. Okay? And going back to some of the work that we heard about earlier, Mark Dugan's work, what we saw was that women have a lot higher life expectancy than men. Okay? And especially as we move into the far right-hand quadrant of this graph, and we look at the NSHAP data from 2006 and 2010, what we see is that women's network sizes are larger and grow larger over time. Okay? And so a lot of the social support that is important to adults later in life, women actually are doing better there than men. Okay? But overall, in other aspects of life and earlier than age about 65, men and women's networks don't vary greatly. Okay, so that's network size overall. one of the things that we've talked about all day is the importance of how people are doing at work and in their actual state of employment. And so here what we can do is look specifically at the changes that have occurred in networks over time with respect to who people talk to, okay, and who people interact with in their daily lives. And so this, I think, very much speaks to some of the trends that we've already talked about. This is the Civilian Workforce Participation Survey. The civilian workforce participation rate is a bit different than the unemployment rates that we heard about earlier. It has to do with taking into account everyone in the economy, whether or not they're actively looking for work. But what we see is a general convergence, where as in 1950, there was a 50-point difference between the workforce participation rate between men and women. Today, those numbers are much closer together, and there's about a 17-point difference. And so one of the things that we can ask is how, given that the fact that women have entered the workplace, how that's affected the social networks that they have. And could that be some of what helps explain this similarity in the networks that men and women have? Okay. And so specifically, when it comes to the workplace, we know that social networks are incredibly important, that the advice, the information, and the mentoring that people get in the workplace has a profound effect on the promotions that they receive, on the salaries that they earn, and the jobs that they get. And so if we double click on the type of ties that compose individuals' networks, we begin to get a much richer story about differences between women and men. So this is data from the 2010 GSS survey. And what I have on the left-hand side are the number of contacts that men reported in areas of a person being a spouse, their children, their siblings, and other kin, as well as their neighbors, coworkers, advisors, friends, and their overall network size. Okay? And I compare that to what women report in that same survey. And if I can draw your attention to the coworker category, what we see is that men report about 2x the number of coworker ties in their network than women. And that number actually, that ratio hasn't actually gone down. If anything, it's trended up. So in 1985, that ratio was 1.7, okay, and not the 1.9 that it appears to be in the most recent survey. And so in terms of beginning to unpack and understand and continue to understand the stalled gender revolution, I think very much some of the story is the stagnation of the networks that people have in the workplace and the networks that they have in their communities and their civic organizations that help them do things like get jobs. Okay. I'll also mention that compared to these other categories, like total kinship ties and other aspects of non-kinship ties like neighbors and friends, okay, men and women are much more similar. Okay? Women actually tend to do a little bit better when it comes to the number of friendship ties and slightly better when it comes to their kinship ties, okay, than men. But the starkest difference really does come down to this difference in coworker relationships and what's happening in the workplace. Okay. So this is a summary of the data that I analyzed. And I thought instead of just leaving you with this bad news, I've loved the questions about what everybody can do. And social networks is one of those things that each of you right now can do something about. Many of you might be aware that on March 8th, a movement was started. Let me get this up. Called Start with 8. Okay? And so it launched on Women's Day on March 8th, and the whole idea was to connect 8 new women in your network to 8 new people. Okay? To think about the people that you know and how you can uniquely be a broker, introduce them to someone that they don't know, and that could provide them social resources. And along with that, the organization that started this has really done this out of a profound understanding of just how important this is, especially as we think about the sorts of resources women need that are in that kind of 1% range that Emmanuel talked about earlier, where there's only around 15% of women earning the top 1% of incomes. In Silicon Valley, for example, in terms of venture capital, only 2% of women, or only 2% of all the funding gets allocated to women. Okay? And something like 18 Black female founders have earned more than $1 million in venture capital, which, if you know how much venture capital flows through this place, it's just not a lot. Okay? So I encourage each of you to think about the networks that you have and the way that you can break down some of the differences in the networks that men and women have. So with that, thank you very much.